So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the 100-plus year timeline of surveys that have existed in the U.S. And it's really the real history of employee surveys going all the way back to the early 1900s. As I mentioned in a video before, surveys have been around since the early 1900s. And initially, they were designed to try to measure how people were doing. There was a lot of conflict between companies and employees at the time. Labor unions unions were beginning to form. Workers were not at the time, in some cases, being treated well. And there was a lot of disagreement between management and employees way back when, which is not to say that it doesn't sometimes happen today as well. But the whole idea here is that the history really timelined out, took off in the 50s, and that's really where attitude surveys and or surveys that measured morale began to take place. And the surveys at this time used Rensis-Likkert's, it's actually pronounced Likert, not Likert, Rensis-Likkert's scale of strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree or strongly disagree. It was a scale that he developed in 1932 that later got adopted by the federal government for use in measuring how people felt surrounding World War II. And that scale got used for surveys that very quickly began to look like a standardized test, which you see on the screen. They felt a bit like tests. They weren't really very successful, and they were abandoned in the 1980s. Not so much because of Likkert's scale, but just what was being measured, the questions that were being asked. The numbers weren't going up over time. So that then shifted in the 1980s to satisfaction, which is all about whether people had what they needed or wanted at work. There was a body of research that was done, job needs, demands research that was done that really focused in on burnout and what was leading to people turning over or leaving an organization. One of the key things that was communicated at the time, and it's still true today, is that people want to feel like they've got the tools and resources needed to do their job. And if they don't have those tools and resources, they're much more likely to go someplace that provides them. Smart research that was used starting in the 1980s, that's still measured today. Those numbers have not increased over time either. They've stayed very steady at 60%. In the 2000s, we shifted to engagement. Employee engagement is high level defined as how much an employee is committed to helping their organization achieve its goals, but there's different definitions by organization, and we'll see that as we kind of continue through these slides. Still, it looks and feels like tests. They became digital and use the same Likert scale to measure that. The inconsistent definitions is really a problem. We'll talk more about that in a bit. We know that according to the news and according to articles that have been published, engagement is not something that has improved over time. And in fact, a lot of scholarly groups and or smart individuals, scientific-based research is pointing to the fact that engagement is not achieving the results that it was intended to achieve. Also interestingly is that the father, if you will, of employee engagement, William Kahn, was interviewed and went on record saying, hey, employee engagement is fundamentally and violently different than what I wrote about back in 1990 in that interview. So engagement really isn't something that has worked very effectively well, but a lot of people have just continued to jump on this bandwagon. These are the real numbers as published by kind of the leading engagement measurers, if you will, which is Qualtrics, Culture Amp, Gallup. We could throw Glint and a few others in there. But these are the real statistics that they're publishing. So you can see kind of that flat line of like 0% increase over time or 3% decrease over time. Qualtrics, 16% decrease over time. And there's just there haven't been results. So if we were running a company and these were our financial results, people wouldn't invest in our company. Now, there's a lot of reasons why employee engagement doesn't work, not the least of which is that no one seems to agree on what it means. So if you were starting any business, you talk to any smart executive, talk to any owner, if your customer base doesn't understand what it is that you're selling, you're not going to be very effective at selling that product and service. Shockingly, this is something that's gotten sold to just millions of companies worldwide, and there's hundreds of millions being spent on measuring this thing that people don't understand. And it really comes down to the inconsistent definitions. And it's the fact that whether you're using Glint or Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or Quantum Workplace or Great Place to Work, Gallup, Culture Amp, all of these companies define engagement differently and also measure it differently. So if I'm using Glint, it's all about the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral energies that our employees feel. If it's Qualtrics, it's the level of commitment that our employees have to helping. If it's SurveyMonkey, it's enthusiasm and commitment. If it's Quantum Workplace, it's mental and emotional connection. And the list goes on. So these different things that are being measured are not consistent from company to company, which creates a lot of confusion. And the outcomes are obviously very, very different from company to company, but they haven't really been particularly great. So I'm going to zoom in a bit on this just to make sure that you can see these, because this is really important. This is how engagement is measured. And there was a really great article written in 2014 by Sachs and Grumman, where they talked about employee engagement and the history of surveys and how we got here. Like, how did we get to this point where we're measuring this thing that nobody can agree on a definition? How do we get to this point where we're asking questions that don't really appear to be different in any way than the questions we were asking during the satisfaction time period and or even earlier, the attitude and morale surveys? And they really illustrate the fact that there's been very little research in the area of the questions that are asked. There's been research about what's driving turnover. There's been research about what drives people to want to be attracted to a job. And in both cases, employee happiness is the key to whether a person leaves and or whether a person reaches to work for a workplace. And yet no one before Amazing Workplace was measuring employee happiness, which is why we've got the registered trademark on employee happiness, is because no one's measuring it. Like, no one was asking the right questions. No one was finding out how people felt, why they felt that way. And what we see here on the screen are the questions that are tied to the engagement scores for Culture Amp, Qualtrics, Glint, and Gallup. I cut off the Gallup questions. There's like 13 there. But when we just look at these questions and we look at the angle or the approach or what is it we're trying to understand as a company if we're asking our people these questions, and how is that going to be responded to if I'm an employee? We'll start with Culture Amp, not to pick on them, but I'm proud to work for a company. Well, okay, that's not a bad question. That's not bad feedback to have as an organization. I'd love for my people to be proud working for my company, but why are they proud to work for my company, or why not? That's not asked. I would recommend my company as a great place to work. Again, that's a cool thing to know as a company. I'd love for my people to be proud of my company. I'd love for them to recommend my company, but neither one of these questions really gets to the heart of what matters to an employee. Neither one of these questions conversationally gets in there and understands how they're feeling, what's going well, what isn't going well. I rarely think about looking for another job at a company or for a job at another company. Again, this is all about sort of selfishly not wanting turnover. I'm not trying to be critical of companies that send these out. I'm just explaining that these are not questions that if I go and I sit down with somebody and I present them, if I present these to a friend, I see myself still working at this company in 2 years' time. My company motivates me to go above and beyond what I would in a similar role elsewhere. Well, that's all about what can I get out of you? What can I get out of you? What's important to me as a company, not what's important to you. And these questions go on and on that way. Qualtrics, I feel proud to tell people where I work. This company motivates me to go above and beyond my role. I would recommend this company to family or friends. It's a great place to work. I see myself working at this company in 2 years' time. You can see these statements are very similar. And Glint, how happy are you working at the company? I would recommend company. It's a great place to work. They used to use 11 questions instead of 2. Microsoft did a whole research article about the fact that they could still get 95% accurate if they just dropped it to 2, knowingly reducing the accuracy by 5%. Shocking to me as a researcher and as somebody that's studied this space for some time. Gallup's got, well, they had 13 questions. I believe they've got a few more that they've added, but how satisfied are you with your company as a place to work? I know what's expected of me at work. I've got the materials and equipment I need to do my job, do my work right. What's nice about Gallup is they've kept the job demands, resources, or satisfaction research in their surveys. What's sort of not nice is they've just taken those old surveys that measured satisfaction, erased satisfaction as the name of the survey, and slapped on engagement. Not a lot of change here, but what we're looking at are questions that don't matter to people. What we're looking at are things that we're sending out to our people, and it's disengaging by design if you just use the normal plain English dictionary definition of engagement, to be. But But yet we're still sending these things out there. We're still using this as the way that we measure and or compare employee engagement. And it's not particularly effective, and it's not reducing turnover. Turnover has not materially changed as a result of engagement. And in fact, in many cases, engaged companies, engaged groups still quit their jobs. Case in point, I was running a team, highly engaged, working at a publicly traded company, and our scores were the best in the company. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm just saying we had the highest engagement scores in the company. Yet many of us left because we weren't happy. It had nothing to do with our engagement scores. So engagement is not an indicator of low turnover. In other words, high engagement does not mean low turnover. High engagement does not mean happiness. High engagement simply means that we're getting answers to these questions that are very work focused, very work centric, very company centric, and not people centric. We're not focusing on we're not centering what we're doing on our people. And that's the biggest problem with engagement surveys is the research that's been done, the way they're designed, the indices or indexes that they use to measure engagement, the questions that they have in that little bucket that measures engagement don't matter to employees. There's a better way to do this, and it's employee happiness through a conversation that interacts with your people where you can find out how they feel and why they feel that way. So hopefully this is helpful. Again, happy to spend time with you talking about Amazing Workplace and how measuring employee happiness actually meaningfully improves the things that matter to most businesses, which is recruiting, productivity, and retention.